The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been called at 0347 Standard Time, which meant either someone had declared war, or the humans were about to do something spectacularly stupid again, given recent events. Ambassador Vex-Tar of the Hegemony was betting on the latter. "Ladies, gentlemen, and various other sentient beings," announced Council Speaker Mordak, his forearms gesturing dramatically as his voice boomed across the amphitheater. "We are here to address the situation regarding the recent actions of the Terran Federation." Vex-Tar's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his species. The situation. That was certainly one way to describe the complete annihilation of 3 Korvan battle fleets, the systematic destruction of every Korvan mining operation in the Outer Rim, and the rather creative way the humans had turned the Korvan homeworld's defense grid into an expensive light show. "The Korvan Supremacy has filed a formal complaint," continued Mordak, his tone suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. "They claim the Terran Federation has violated the Nexus Accords by engaging in what they term disproportionate retaliation." A ripple of what could generously be called laughter swept through the assembled delegates. The Nexus Accords, signed 12 standard years ago, had been humanity's first major diplomatic achievement since joining the galactic community. They'd established rules for interspecies conflict resolution, trade disputes, and territorial boundaries. More importantly, they'd given the younger species protection from the older, more established powers. Of course, the Korvans had spent the last 6 months systematically violating every clause of those accords while the Council looked the other way. But apparently, that was just politics when the humans responded. Well, that was a problem. "Ambassador Nix," Mordak called out, his voice carrying the weight of someone who really didn't want to be doing this. "Please present the Korvan position." Nix rose from her delegation's pod, her scaled hide shimmering with the bioluminescent patterns that indicated extreme agitation. The Korvan ambassador had always been arrogant, but now she looked positively murderous, which, considering recent events, was probably not the best look for her species. "Honored Speaker," she began, her voice dripping with barely contained rage, "the Terran Federation has committed acts of unprovoked aggression against sovereign Korvan territory. They have destroyed military vessels, civilian infrastructure, and industrial facilities without warning or justification." The silence that followed was so profound that Vex-Tar could hear the atmospheric recyclers humming in the walls. Finally, a low chuckle echoed from the human delegation's pod. "Oh, that's rich," came a distinctly human voice, laced with what their species called sarcasm. "Unprovoked. Without justification. You know, Ambassador Nix, for a species that prides itself on perfect memory, you seem to have developed a rather convenient case of amnesia." All eyes turned to the human pod, where a single figure was rising. Vex-Tar recognized her immediately. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, the Terran Federation's chief diplomatic representative. She was small by galactic standards, barely reaching Vex-Tar's shoulder, but she had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless at the negotiating table. "Ambassador Vasquez," Mordak said carefully, "the floor recognizes the Terran Federation." Vasquez stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back in what Vex-Tar had learned was a deceptively casual human posture. She looked around the amphitheater slowly, her gaze lingering on each delegation before settling on the Korvan pod. "Thank you, Speaker Mordak. And thank you, Ambassador Nix, for that creative interpretation of recent events. I particularly enjoyed the part about unprovoked aggression. It really showcases your species' talent for fiction." More silence. Vex-Tar found himself leaning forward, his curiosity piqued. Human diplomatic responses usually came in 2 flavors, desperately conciliatory or absolutely devastating. This one was definitely heading toward the latter. "Perhaps," Vasquez continued, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "the Council would like to review the actual sequence of events. You know, just to refresh everyone's memory." She gestured, and a holographic display materialized in the center of the amphitheater. It showed a star map of the disputed sectors, with various colored markers indicating different types of installations and territories. 6 months ago. Otis. Vasquez began, pointing to a cluster of blue markers. The Korvan Supremacy began establishing mining operations in the Vega Nebula. These operations were, according to the Nexus Accords, illegal. The nebula had been designated as a neutral zone, protected from industrial exploitation. The blue markers began flashing red. When the Terran Federation filed a formal complaint, we were told that the Korvan operations were temporary surveys and would be concluded within 30 standard days. That was 6 months ago. Thelnix's scales flashed angry orange. Those operations were necessary for... "I'm not finished," Vasquez interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through hull plating. 3 months ago, Korvan forces began attacking independent trader vessels in the same sector. These attacks were justified as anti-piracy operations, despite the fact that the vessels in question were carrying legitimate cargo and proper identification. The display shifted, showing dozens of small red dots scattered throughout the nebula. When we requested an investigation, we were told that the Korvan military was maintaining order in the region. Apparently, order required the destruction of 47 civilian vessels and the deaths of over 300 innocent beings. The amphitheater was dead silent now. Even the atmospheric recyclers seemed to have stopped humming 2 weeks ago. Vasquez continued, her voice growing colder. Korvan forces attacked and destroyed the research station orbiting Kepler 442 billion. This station was operated by the Terran Federation under a legitimate scientific permit. It was clearly marked as a civilian facility. The attack killed 214 researchers, including 37 beings from 12 different species. The holographic display zoomed in on a particular system, showing the wreckage of what had once been a substantial space station. When we demanded an explanation, we were told that the station had been conducting illegal weapons research and posed a threat to Korvan security. The fact that it was actually studying stellar formation patterns was apparently irrelevant. Thelnix was standing now, her scales cycling through various shades of red and orange. The station was studying stars. Vasquez finished. We have the complete research logs. We have the station's manifest. We have testimony from the survivors. The only weapons on that station were the personal sidearms carried by the security staff. Unless you're suggesting that stellar cartography equipment poses a threat to your military. Supremacy? The sarcasm in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several delegates were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The Korvan delegation, meanwhile, looked like they were about to spontaneously combust. The point is, Vasquez continued, turning back to address the full council, the Korvan Supremacy has spent the last 6 months systematically violating the Nexus Accords while this council turned a blind eye. They've conducted illegal mining operations, attacked civilian vessels, and destroyed a research facility. And when we responded, suddenly we're the aggressors. She paused, letting that sink in. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about something. The Terran Federation tried to resolve this situation through proper diplomatic channels. We filed complaints. We requested investigations. We proposed arbitration. We offered to negotiate. For 6 months, we followed every protocol, respected every procedure, and honored every commitment we made when we signed the Nexus Accords. Her voice was getting harder now, taking on the kind of edge that made even apex predators nervous. The Korvan response was to escalate, to attack, to kill. They made it very clear that they had no intention of honoring the treaties they'd signed or respecting the authority of this council. She gestured again, and the display shifted to show recent battle footage. Korvan warships exploding in brilliant flashes of light, defensive installations being systematically dismantled. The proud Korvan fleet being reduced to space debris with almost casual efficiency. So we responded in kind. We gave them exactly what they seemed to want, a demonstration of what happens when you mistake human patience for human weakness. The footage was spectacular and terrifying. Vextar had seen the preliminary reports, but watching the actual combat recordings was something else entirely. The humans hadn't just defeated the Korvan forces, They'd obliterated them with a precision and efficiency that was genuinely frightening. The Korvan Supremacy destroyed one of our research stations, Vasquez continued. So we destroyed their ability to project military power in the disputed sectors. They killed our civilians. So we eliminated the threat to anyone else's civilians. They violated the Nexus Accords. So we demonstrated why those accords exist in the first place. She turned to face Thelnix directly. You call it disproportionate retaliation. I call it a lesson in consequences. The Terran Federation has no desire for war, but we will not allow our people to be murdered while bureaucrats debate the finer points of interstellar law. The Korvan ambassador was practically vibrating with rage. You dare. I dare to defend my people. Vasquez snapped. I dare to honor the treaties my government signed. I dare to hold other species accountable for their actions. And yes, I dare to respond with overwhelming force when diplomacy fails and civilians die. She turned back to the council, her expression shifting from anger to something much more dangerous, disappointment. The real question here isn't whether the Terran Federation's response was proportionate. The real question is why this council allowed the situation to escalate to this point in the first place. The Nexus Accords weren't just a treaty between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. They were a promise that smaller species would be protected from the predations of larger ones. They were a guarantee that disputes would be resolved through law, not violence. She gestured toward the Korvan delegation. The Korvan Supremacy violated that promise. They ignored the law. They chose violence, and when we responded, you want to condemn us for being too effective. The silence stretched on. Finally, Mordak cleared his throat. Ambassador Vasquez, while the Council appreciates your perspective on these events, the fact remains that the Terran Federation's response has destabilized the entire sector. The destruction of the Korvan fleet has created a power vacuum that has eliminated a threat to every independent species in the region. Vasquez interrupted. The Korvan Supremacy was using their military superiority to bully smaller civilizations, steal resources, and expand their territory. We didn't create instability. We ended it. She paused, then added with a slight smile, unless of course you consider the absence of Korvan aggression to be inherently destabilizing. In which case I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree. The implications hung in the air like a poison cloud. Several delegates were exchanging nervous glances. The Korvan delegation looked like they were about to declare war on the spot. Furthermore, Vasquez continued, apparently oblivious to the tension she was creating, the Terran Federation would like to formally propose a series of amendments to the Nexus Accords. These amendments would establish clearer guidelines for enforcement, create stronger penalties for violations, and ensure that future disputes are resolved more efficiently. She gestured again, and a new document appeared on the holographic display. It was substantial, running to several hundred pages of dense legal text. We believe these amendments will prevent future incidents by making it clear that treaty violations will be met with swift and decisive action. The old system of endless debates and toothless resolutions clearly isn't working. Vextar scanned the document quickly, his mandibles clicking with amusement. The humans hadn't just written amendments, they'd essentially rewritten the entire treaty structure to give themselves broad authority to act as galactic peacekeepers. It was audacious, terrifying, and probably exactly what the galaxy needed. The hegemony will need time to review these proposals, announced Delegate Carthol, speaking for the first time since the session began. Of course, Vasquez replied smoothly. The Terran Federation is prepared to give the Council 30 standard days to consider our amendments. We believe that's more than sufficient time for a thorough review. There was something in her tone that suggested the 30-day deadline wasn't negotiable, and something else that suggested the consequences of rejecting the amendments might be unpleasant. What happens if the Council rejects your proposals? Asked Delegate Nix Era of the Confederacy. Vasquez's smile was perfectly diplomatic and absolutely terrifying. Then the Terran Federation will have to consider our options. We remain committed to peaceful cooperation with all species who share our commitment to the rule of law. As for those who don't, she shrugged. Well, I suppose we'll address that situation when it arises. The session was adjourned shortly after that, with various delegates scrambling to communicate with their home governments. As the amphitheater emptied, Vextar found himself oddly impressed. The humans had just turned a potential war crimes tribunal into a complete restructuring of galactic governance. And they'd done it with such casual efficiency that most of the council probably didn't even realize what had happened. As he made his way back to his quarters, Vextar couldn't help but wonder what the humans would do if the council actually rejected their proposals. Based on what he'd seen today, he was fairly certain he didn't want to find out. The next 30 days were going to be very interesting indeed. 27 days later, Ambassador Vextar stood in his private quarters, staring out at the swirling nebula that surrounded Council Station Alpha. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of backroom negotiations, emergency communications with home governments, and increasingly desperate attempts by various species to figure out exactly what the humans were planning. The answer, as far as Vextar could determine, was absolutely nothing, and that was the most terrifying part. The Terran Federation had made no military movements, no fleet deployments, no diplomatic pressure beyond their initial proposal. They'd simply waited, with the kind of patience that suggested they were supremely confident in the outcome. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. Vextar activated the communication array, and the familiar blue-scaled face of his intelligence contact appeared on the screen. "Ambassador," Zilnera said without preamble, "we have a problem. The Korvan Supremacy has been building a coalition." Vextar's mandibles clicked with interest. "What kind of coalition?" "The kind that's planning to reject the human amendments and simultaneously declare the Terran Federation a rogue state. They've got the Thakari Empire, the Ashen Collective, and about 15 smaller species committed to the plan. That was not good. The Thakari Empire alone commanded a fleet that could rival the humans in size, if not in technology. Combined with the Ashen Collective's industrial capacity and the smaller species support, it represented a significant threat." "What about the major powers?" Vextar asked. "The hegemony is staying neutral. The Confederacy is leaning towards supporting the humans. The Syndicate is, well, they're being the Syndicate. They'll support whoever offers them the best trade deals." Vextar processed this information. A coalition of that size could potentially challenge human military supremacy, but it would be a costly war for everyone involved. The humans had to know this was coming, so why weren't they doing anything about it? "There's something else," Zilnera continued. "The humans have been sending private messages to various species leaders. Short ones. Just a few words each." "What kind of messages?" "That's the strange part. They're not threats or ultimatums, they're just reminders. Historical references, technical specifications, things that shouldn't mean anything but somehow feel significant." Before Vextar could respond, another chime sounded. This one was the emergency alert that meant the council was being called back into session. 3 days early. "I have to go," Vextar said, cutting the connection. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. The amphitheater was packed when Vextar arrived. Every species was represented, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a plasma torch. The human delegation occupied their usual pod, looking remarkably calm for beings who were about to face down half the galaxy. "The Council recognizes the Korvan Supremacy," announced Speaker Mordak, his voice heavy with resignation. Ambassador Thel Nix rose, her scales displaying the confident gold patterns of someone who believed they held the winning hand. "Honored Speaker, the Korvan Supremacy, acting on behalf of a coalition of concerned species, formally rejects the Terran Federation's proposed amendments to the Nexus Accords." She paused dramatically, clearly enjoying the moment. "Furthermore, we hereby declare the Terran Federation to be in violation of galactic law and demand their immediate withdrawal from all disputed territories. The coalition species are prepared to enforce this demand through military action if necessary." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to the human pod, where Ambassador Vasquez was sitting with what could only be described as a look of profound boredom. "Ambassador Vasquez," Mordak said carefully, The floor recognizes the Terran Federation. Vasquez stood slowly, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She looked around the amphitheater with the same casual interest she might show at a particularly dull dinner party. Thank you, Speaker Mordak. And thank you, Ambassador Nix, for that bold declaration. I have to admit I'm impressed. It takes real courage to threaten a species that just demonstrated their military capabilities by turning your entire fleet into scrap metal. She gestured, and a holographic display materialized. But instead of showing star charts or battle footage, it displayed what appeared to be a simple list of names and numbers. Since the Korvan Supremacy seems to have forgotten the lessons of recent events, perhaps a brief refresher is in order. The Terran Federation has been monitoring the military preparations of the coalition species. We know about the fleet movements, the weapons stockpiles, the strategic planning sessions. We know everything. The display shifted, showing detailed intelligence reports on each coalition member's military capabilities. The level of detail was staggering. Deployment schedules, weapon specifications, command structures, even the personal files of key military leaders. The Thakari Empire has mobilized 60% of their battle fleet, Vasquez continued conversationally. The Ascian Collective has increased weapons production by 300%. The Velthari have recalled their deep space patrols. Should I continue? Bye. Thelnix's scales were cycling through increasingly agitated colors. How did you? Trade secret. Vasquez replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The point is, we know you're planning to attack us. We know when, we know where, and we know how. The question is, do you really want to go through with this? She gestured again, and the display shifted to show a new set of images. These were technical schematics, but not for any technology Vextar recognized. 3 months ago, the Terran Federation completed development of what we call the Prometheus system. It's a rather elegant solution to the problem of large-scale military threats. Would you like to see how it works? The schematics rotated, showing a device that looked deceptively simple. It's a series of interconnected modules, each no larger than a standard shuttle, connected by quantum entanglement communicators. The beauty of the Prometheus system, Vasquez explained, is that it doesn't require massive fleets or extensive infrastructure. Just a few small devices, properly positioned, and the ability to manipulate space-time on a localized scale. She looked directly at the Thakari delegation. For example, the Thakari homeworld has 3 natural satellites, beautiful moons, really. Perfect for supporting the kind of industrial infrastructure that makes your empire so powerful. It would be such a shame if those moons were to relocate. The display showed a simulation of the Thakari system, with the 3 moons suddenly disappearing from their orbits and reappearing in deep space, far from their parent planet. Of course, the sudden absence of tidal forces would cause significant disruption to your planetary environment. Ocean currents would shift, weather patterns would change, and your industrial coastal cities would face some rather serious flooding. But I'm sure your people are adaptable. The Thakari delegation was staring at the display in horror. Without their moons, their homeworld would become an environmental disaster zone within months. The Ascian Collective presents a different challenge, Vasquez continued, turning to address their delegation. Your species has always been proud of your industrial efficiency, all those automated factories, all those precisely timed supply chains. It would be unfortunate if your primary manufacturing worlds were to experience some temporal displacement. The simulation shifted to show the Ascian industrial core, with several planets suddenly aging at an accelerated rate. Factories crumbling, infrastructure collapsing, entire civilizations withering away and fast forward. Nothing permanent, of course. Just a few decades of accelerated time in selected locations. Your people would survive, but rebuilding your industrial base would take, well, decades, maybe centuries. The Ascian delegates were frantically whispering among themselves. Their entire civilization was built on industrial supremacy. Without their manufacturing capacity, they would become a third-rate power overnight. As for the smaller coalition members, Vasquez said, her tone becoming almost friendly, we've prepared customized responses for each of your species. The VL Thari would find their interstellar communications networks experiencing some interesting quantum interference. The Keth Mori would discover that their agricultural worlds have developed some unusual gravitational anomalies. The Zar Keth would face a rather dramatic realignment of their solar system's asteroid belt. She paused, letting the implications sink in. The beautiful thing about the Prometheus system is that it's entirely non-lethal. We're not talking about genocide or even conventional military action, just creative problem-solving. Your species would survive, but your ability to threaten others would be significantly reduced. The Thelnix was standing now, her scales flashing through every color in the spectrum. This is madness. You cannot simply threaten entire worlds. We're not threatening them. Vasquez replied calmly. We're demonstrating the consequences of poor decision-making. The Terran Federation has no desire to use these capabilities. We would much rather continue our peaceful cooperation with all species who share our commitment to the rule of law. She gestured once more, and the display shifted to show the amended Nexus Accords. The choice is quite simple. You can accept our proposed amendments, which establish clear rules for interstellar conduct and provide for swift resolution of disputes. Or you can proceed with your military action and discover firsthand why the Terran Federation doesn't need large fleets to defend itself. The amphitheater was dead silent. The coalition species were staring at the display in shock, while the neutral powers were frantically calculating the implications of what they'd just witnessed. Of course, Vasquez continued, there is a third option. Any species that wishes to withdraw from the coalition and accept the amended accords will be welcomed as a partner in the new galactic order. We believe in redemption. After all, she looked directly at each coalition delegation in turn. The Terran Federation will give you 1 standard hour to make your decision. After that, we will assume that silence equals consent for military action, and we will respond accordingly. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap with the air of someone who had just finished discussing the weather. The next hour was the longest in galactic history. One by one, the smaller coalition species broke ranks. The Velthari were first, followed quickly by the Keth Mori and the Zar Keth. Within 30 minutes, only the Korvan Supremacy, the Thakari Empire, and the Ossian Collective remained committed to military action. At the 50-minute mark, the Thakari delegation requested an emergency consultation with their home government. 5 minutes later, they announced their withdrawal from the coalition. The Ossian Collective held out until the 58th minute before capitulating. At the 59-minute mark, Ambassador Thelnix stood slowly, her scales displaying the dull gray of defeat. The Korvan Supremacy, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The Korvan Supremacy accepts the amended Nexus Accords. The relief in the amphitheater was palpable. Several delegates actually applauded, though whether they were celebrating the peaceful resolution or the demonstration of human power was unclear. Excellent, Vasquez said, standing once more. The Terran Federation is pleased to welcome all species into the new galactic order. Together, we will build a safer, more prosperous future for all sentient beings. She paused, then added with that same terrifying smile, of course, the Prometheus system will remain active, but just in case anyone has second thoughts about their commitment to peace. As the session concluded and the delegates filed out, Vextar found himself both impressed and deeply unsettled. The humans had just restructured galactic civilization without firing a single shot. They'd demonstrated technological capabilities that bordered on the godlike, and they'd done it all with the casual efficiency of a species that had clearly been planning this outcome for years. Walking back to his quarters, Vextar couldn't help but wonder what other surprises the Terran Federation had in store. The amended Nexus Accords would give them broad authority to intervene in interstellar disputes, backed by weapons that could reshape entire star systems. It was a new age in galactic history. Whether it would be an age of peace or an age of human dominance remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same. The humans had kept their word. They'd given the galaxy a choice between law and chaos, between cooperation and conflict. The fact that they'd made the choice easy by demonstrating the consequences of choosing poorly was simply good diplomacy. As Vextar settled into his quarters and began composing his report to the hegemony leadership, he couldn't help but smile. The humans had played the game perfectly. They'd turned a potential war into a diplomatic victory, transformed their enemies into reluctant allies, and established themselves as the galaxy's new peacekeepers. It was brilliant, terrifying, and absolutely effective. The humans had proven that sometimes the best way to win a war was to make it clear that fighting one would be a very bad idea. The treaty had been betrayed, and humanity had delivered their reckoning, not with fleets and armies, but with the promise of consequences so severe that even the most aggressive species chose submission over conflict. And the truly frightening part: Vextar was beginning to suspect that the humans had been planning this outcome from the moment they'd first signed the original Nexus Accords. They'd spent 12 years building relationships, gathering intelligence, and developing the tools they'd need to reshape galactic civilization. Now they had everything they needed to ensure that peace would be maintained, whether the galaxy wanted it or not. The question was no longer whether the humans would use their power, but how they would choose to wield it. One thing was certain: the galaxy was now a much more interesting place to live,